All right. Let's see, call to order. Roll call.
Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance.
Who does?
Pledge of Allegiance first.
We can do Pledge of Allegiance.
We can do that. That's all right.
I just have to turn around.
We can do that last time. Pledge allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Douglas Derlich,
Here.
Richard Clark,
Here.
City Lewis Jr.
Here.
Bobby Bryan is running a little late today, so she'll be joining us. Oh, she just walked in. She's here. Donita Dampier.
Here.
I received communication that Ms. Paula Stark won't be here in attendance tonight. Tony Jones.
Here.
Ekaterina Akulova.
Here.
Alan Pepin.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Let's see. It's been a couple months for a meeting. It's just not fresh in my head anymore. All right, we have all our staff folks here. All right, next item is approval of the minutes.
And also, I want to add to the approvals. Last meeting, we had a correction, and I brought him in today, and they weren't signed already for the June 11, where I misspelled your name.
That's okay.
Yeah, so it's been corrected and been signed already.
That's good, thank you, sir.
I reviewed the minutes prior to coming to the meeting, so I'll move to accept the minutes as written.
I'll second.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Also, I would like to add that Ms. Ekaterina Kulova, you are a voting member tonight since we have an absence in the thank you.
All right. New business. I understand we have some folks from Kissimmee here as well. So welcome. Let's see, we have Megan McDonald. Who's here to teach us all kinds of good stuff. So you guys are up.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
could the folks from Kissimmee introduce themselves to us?
Sure, why not?
My name is Bill Dupre. I'm an architect in Kissimmee.
Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I'm Adriana Serrano. I'm an interior designer and remodeler in Kissimmee.
Welcome.
And they both serve on Kissimmee's Historic Preservation Board, which is also a certified local government. So Trevor was nice enough to let me invite them and their board to come. So I'm glad that y'all could make it. And I'm sorry that my back is going to be to you. I apologize. All right. Well, you all should have a folder in front of you that has an agenda and then copies of each of the 3 presentations we're going to go through today. And then some handouts that I'll explain a little bit later on. The first presentation that we're going to do, I like to do a brief overview of the programs that we have at the Division of Historical Resources because they can be very helpful to you in your work here. So I apologize to the 3 of you who have seen a version of this at the DeLand training already, but I have pared it down. It'll be quick and painless. But we'll start with that, and then we're going to go into a short presentation about board basics, just some things that will probably be helpful to you as a historic preservation board member. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about design review, because that is what a lot of board members struggle with and spend most of their time as board members doing. And I've found that people really enjoy having a hands-on experience without the pressure of it being real applications. So that one will be pretty participation heavy, and you'll have a chance to ask questions and kind of work through some things. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first presentation is Historic Preservation in the Division of Historical Resources. And y'all can see these on your screens? Okay. All right, so first things first, I just need to mention the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, because this is the piece of legislation that established historic preservation as we know it in the United States. The National Historic Preservation Act created the state historic preservation offices, which includes the Florida Division of Historical Resources. So if you hear people use the statement State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, they're talking about the Florida Division of Historical Resources here. In other states, they have different names, but that's the body we're talking about. The National Historic Preservation Act created the National Register of Historic Places, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I'm sure you've heard that term before. It created the Secretary of the Interior Standards, which are basically the criteria that we use to evaluate work that's going to be done to historic structures. Created the Historic Preservation Fund, which funds each of the state historic preservation offices in every state, and then also is given to CLGs through subgrants that come through the State Historic Preservation Office. It created the Section 106 process, which is a process of review for federally funded projects that might impact historic structures, so like roadway projects going through an area. If it's federally funded, if there's any federal dollars involved, there has to be an analysis of the structures along the route to determine if any of them are historic on the National Register or eligible for the National Register that could be impacted. And that process was created by the National Historic Preservation Act. And then lastly, as I already said, it created the state historic preservation offices. So here we have Florida in the middle. You can see every state has kind of a different name. The trendier, newer, rebranded state historic preservation offices have like History Nebraska, History Colorado. And then every state falls under different levels of government. So some are part of Department of Natural Resources. For some reason in Florida, we're under the Secretary of State's office. I don't know that any other state has us under that section, but it works. And some are their own independent historical commissions. Here's our offices in Tallahassee. If you ever participate in a National Register Review Board meeting, it's in this building. If you ever have a grant going before our grant panel, this building. If you're ever applying for a historical marker through our office, it goes through a meeting in this building. But this is where most things happen. This is where my office is. The only thing that really isn't in this building are our archaeologists, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So these are the programs I wanted to talk about a little bit today, just briefly to give you an overview, because they may be programs you'd want to be involved with, or that may be helpful to you in your work. First, you all just went through the certification process of becoming a certified local government, which I'll refer to as CLG from here on out. But to give you a basic overview of what that means and why you went through a process of becoming one, basically the Certified Local Government Program was created in order to link local governments into the state and federal historic preservation program. So if you noticed, when I went over the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the CLG program was not on there. It took until 1980 for folks to realize, you know what, we really haven't created a mechanism for local governments to be involved in the National Historic Preservation Program, so we need to create something. And so the CLG program was created for that purpose. It allows local governments to get involved in the National Register process and the Section 106 process. It created a way in order to disseminate part of the Historic Preservation Fund to the local governments through grants. And then it also creates a system for showing which local governments have expertise in historic preservation and have good, effective programs in place. So when you guys went through the process of creating your local historic preservation ordinance and finding qualified board members and interested citizens, you went through a process of building up the framework for a historic preservation program that was set up to be really successful. And then you're also eligible for grants, which we'll talk about, technical assistance and training like we're doing today. So what does a CLG do? You became certified, you have your board in place. What does it mean now that you're a certified local government? You've been tasked with a couple of responsibilities by being linked into the state and federal historic preservation program. The first is that you're going to maintain an ongoing system of survey. You're already doing this. You applied for a grant through your Main Street program, and I believe it was awarded, and it's going to be started soon. So you have already started your survey work, identifying the resources in your community that may be historic under different criteria, and identifying ways that you can help preserve them. Identifying and designating historic resources. So this can mean a couple of things. It can mean listing them on the National Register to bring awareness and to honor those resources. Unfortunately, the National Register does not protect resources. It's just honorary. And it might also mean identifying and designating them at the local level, which does come with protections. We'll talk more about that later. A third responsibility you have is to conduct design review of properties that have been locally designated. And then lastly, one of your responsibilities is to educate the public about historic preservation. All right, so now we're going to move into grants. We have two types of grants that are available through the Division of Historical Resources: small matching grants and special category grants. Small matching grants are for planning projects, education projects, surveys, National Register nominations, and smaller projects like that. And that is what your survey grant was. It was a survey project, a small matching grant. And you have to be a public organization or a nonprofit in order to apply for these grants. So unfortunately, private property owners can't apply for these grants through our office. If you want to learn more about the grants program, I highly recommend that you go to the webpage I have listed on the screen. They have PowerPoint presentations and all kinds of information, and you can also contact them directly to learn more. A couple of examples I wanted to show you. The top right, it's kind of hard to read, but it says Gainesville Mid-Century Design Guidelines. We'll talk about design guidelines today, but basically they expand upon the Secretary of the Interior standards and the criteria that you've outlined in your ordinance in terms of how you want people to be pursuing work on historic structures. And so you can create a set of design guidelines that are catered to the architectural styles that exist in St. Cloud, the history of the development of St. Cloud, and what kinds of standards you want local residents to be adhering to when they're repairing and rehabilitating their historic structures. And I have some examples that I'll pass out later. The bottom left, Florida's mid-century modern architecture. Believe it or not, mid-century resources are now historic. And so this was a survey that was done basically of the whole state to determine what some of our greatest mid-century modern resources, but you can also do local surveys. In the middle, that is an example of an education small matching grant. And basically what it is the city of St. Augustine had these plaques in front of historic structures, and then they, using the grant funds, created these QR codes that they put beneath the plaques. And folks could go up and scan it with their phone, and then they'd be led to an interactive website that told you all about the building. And so you can get creative with the education project. It doesn't just have to be, curriculum or something like that. And then the bottom right is the City of St. Augustine's Historic Preservation Plan, which was a really huge document that outlined all their goals for like the next 10 to 20 years for historic preservation in the city. And that's an example of a planning grant that can be funded through the small matching grants. I did not change the dates on the application window because they haven't been announced for the next year, but they will probably still be April 1st to June 1st. So if you're looking to apply for a grant next year, the application window will probably open April 1st. Do you have a bottle of water by chance? I'm getting over a cold, I'm sorry. I'm gonna run to the water fountain.
Somebody's got one for you. I think. There it is.
Don't mind the tears streaming down my face from coughing. All right. But yes, if you'd like to apply for grants, the cycle will open in April. We also have special category grants. These are for our large projects, rehabilitation projects. You may have seen these around the state, but this is when a publicly owned building needs to undergo serious work. These projects are for up to $500,000 with a match, so they can be up to $1 million projects. I apologize, my voice is coming back, I think. These are 2-year projects, whereas the small matching grants are 1-year projects, so these take a lot longer to complete because of their size and scale. Sorry. And this is Tim Konefke's contact information, who's our grants manager. Thank you so much. All right, so I saw driving around that you already have a number of historic markers, so you seem to be familiar with how to go about getting them. But basically, the historic marker program is much less stringent than, say, your local register program or the National Register program. So if a property wouldn't necessarily qualify for either of those registers, you could honor it in another way through a historic marker. There's all kinds of criteria here on the left-hand side that you can look at that they can fall under, but it also doesn't have to fall under these criteria. They cost $2,000 if they're single-sided, meaning they say the same content on both sides. And if you want it to start on one side and continue on the other, it costs $2,330. And there's a whole application portal online that you can use in order to apply for these, and I've put a screenshot here. Michael Hart is our state historic marker coordinator. You have his contact here. All right, the National Register of Historic Places. I believe you all have 2 properties in St. Cloud that are on the National Register. Is that correct? The VFW right over here, and what's the second building?
It's the Grand Army Republic.
The guard.
So like I mentioned previously, the National Register is an honorary designation that doesn't come with any protections for the property, but it is kind of a big deal to have properties honored in such a way. And it also can come with benefits for income-producing properties. If a property is an income-producing property and on the National Register, it's eligible for the federal rehabilitation tax credits, which can be a huge incentive for developers who may choose to build a new building instead of rehabilitate an old one. So if something that you are trying to do is draw developers to your downtown to invest in your historic structures and rehabilitate them, after you finish your survey, something you might consider doing is creating a National Register district so that those properties would be eligible for tax credits. I have an entire webinar on the tax credits if you'd like it. I could send it to you so you can learn more. I hope I make it. I'm sorry. We nominate all kinds of properties. They don't just have to be buildings. Archaeological sites can be listed on the National Register. Works of art and objects. We have locomotives listed on the National Register. Works of feats of engineering and districts. In the bottom right, I included Martin Luther King Jr.'s birth home in Atlanta. We often list buildings not just for their architecture, but for their affiliation with people who were significant to our past, and that's an example here. The National Register does not force property owners to keep their properties the same. Like I said, it's purely honorary, it's not regulatory. So we've had examples where we listed a property on the National Register and they were torn down within the following month, and there were no repercussions because it was simply honorary. It does not force property owners to let the public on their property, and it doesn't lead to acquisition by the state or federal government. The things people believe about the National Register are crazy, so I'd just like to clarify them. So to determine if a property is eligible, you're basically looking at 3 things. Its age, is it 50 years old? Its significance, is it associated with important events, people, or design principles? And its integrity, meaning its condition, its physical condition. Does it still convey its history in the state that it's in? And I have on the right-hand side a copy of our preliminary site information questionnaire form. And this is what you fill out and send to our office if you're interested to know if a property is eligible for the National Register. And you have a copy of this in your folder. And Ruben Acosta is in charge of the National Register program. Here's his contact information. And then the Florida Master Site File is kind of a misunderstood program, but basically the way I like to describe it is that it's an archive of information about historic properties and archaeological sites, so on and so forth. It's not accessible to the public in terms of being able to search it on a website, but if you have a property that you want to know what information we have on it, you can just contact the site file and they'll send you everything they have. So any survey form that's ever been submitted for it, if it's listed on the National Register, they'll have the National Register form. But know that this is available to you. I do like to mention that just because something has been surveyed and information has been sent to the site file doesn't mean that that building is automatically eligible for the National Register. It doesn't mean it's historically significant. People will send us forms about all kinds of properties. We're not deciding anything about it. We're just keeping the information so that it's there. And yeah, I really, if you decide after you do your survey and you do a National Register nomination or you do a local designation, we would really appreciate if you would send those documents to the site file so that we can have that information there. Because really the site file is just the most in-depth piece of information about a building that you could find anywhere in the state. So by submitting your local designation reports and things like that, that just helps to further deepen the information and the knowledge that we have. And here's the site file contact information. You guys are a Main Street. I'm sorry that Paula couldn't be here. She's the Main Street Director, is that correct? But CLGs, and when I say that, I mean the Historic Preservation Board and Main Streets can have a really good relationship that can help work together to further historic preservation in your community. And so I like to talk about Main Street and the ways that you can work together. So they're a little bit different in that Main Street is also about economic development, and they have to balance economic development with historic preservation, whereas you all are much more focused on historic preservation itself, which does have economic benefits. But I polled some of the certified local governments recently and asked them to tell me about their experience working together with the Main Streets, and this is, I like to share this quote from Fernandina Beach. She said, "Working closely with the Main Street program allows both organizations to benefit and achieve our shared goals. A lot of Main Streets will have their board members attend y'all's meetings and vice versa. Oftentimes they work together to apply for grant funding, which I believe is what you all did for the survey. Main Street actually applied for the survey grant. Sometimes CLGs are involved with the Main Street Design Committee. Does St. Cloud's have a design committee? Okay, so some Main Streets will have a design committee that's focused on rewarding and recognizing good design in their Main Street district. So they might do like facade reimbursement grants, or they might have an awards ceremony or something like that. But that design component is just kind of a perfect meld with what you all do. So if St. Cloud has a design committee or has any intention of creating one, that would be a good fit for perhaps one of you to be involved with, because you can make sure that good work that's being awarded on the Main Street is actually in line with what you would want to see in terms of historic preservation. So something to consider. And then just working together on upcoming events and sharing resources. And the last thing I want to talk about is the Bureau of Archaeological Research. I am not an archaeologist. I know very little about archaeology, but we have an entire bureau devoted to archaeology, so if that comes up in your work, these are great people to contact. So you have all that contact information there. All right, I kind of breezed through that. I just want to save my voice for the last two presentations here. This presentation, Board Member Basics, you all have been serving for at least a year now, is that right? You've been at this for a while. Some of this will probably be review, but these are just some things that I think are important for board members to know and to consider. So we have our commissioner commandments here. I'm going to read through them first, and then we'll go through them individually. First, if you haven't already, you need to read your ordinance, and then you need to read it again, and then you need to read it again, and then you need to refer to it whenever you don't understand something or you're not sure how a procedure is supposed to go. So read your ordinance. Know your design guidelines. I don't think you all have design guidelines just yet, so we'll get to that. Know your historic resources inventory. I think the information that you have is a little older, which is why you've applied for a grant for a new survey. So that new survey will be very, very helpful to you. Keep educating yourself on historic preservation issues. Look at what you're doing right now. Work with the public and educate them on what you know. Know your partners in local government. Do your homework. Look at the site before the hearing. Put reasons for every decision into the motion, making that decision. Be objective and consistent in your decisions, and plan for preservation. All right, so let's go through these. So, you've all hopefully read your ordinance. Can anybody tell me how a member of the public, if they own a historic property and they want to get it listed on your local register, do you know how they would go about doing that?
Can't reiterate it, no.
No? Okay.
We all point them to Trevor, actually.
Yeah.
Does Trevor want to explain it? You don't have to stand or anything. You can just.
You're among friends here, Trevor. It's all right.
Some communities have an actual application form, and so if someone's interested in listing their property, they'd come to the planning office to the contact for your board, and they could fill it out, and it would tell you some basic information, what they know about the property, why they think it's historically significant, why they think it meets your criteria. Because you actually have criteria outlined in your ordinance that says what a property has to meet in order to be on your local register. So that's not something you're familiar with. You will want to review that to see what criteria a property has to meet in order to be on your local register. All right? I think your criteria in your ordinance references the Secretary of the Interior standards, which we will go through. Most ordinances do. They're the federal guidelines, and most people model their criteria after that. And then some folks like to expand upon that, like I mentioned previously, with local design guidelines. All right, so you want to know if there's a process outlined in your ordinance for how to deal with demolition by neglect. So basically, if someone has basically abandoned their property or they've just decided they're not going to keep it up anymore, you know, how your board is able to remedy that, what actions you're able to take. And there should be some, at least minor provisions in your ordinance about that. Does anybody know what the consequences are for non-compliance in terms of if somebody came to your board with some changes and then they ignored your advice and did something else? No?
I'd imagine they wouldn't get a CO.
Well, let's say they didn't get the CO and they did the work anyway. And they're a locally designated property. They didn't get the CO.
It's probably going to be very similar to what it would be if they actually did work without a permit.
Wasn't that the fee schedule that we made?
Yeah.
That there was a fee schedule that we all voted on, and I think it was $150 or $200. Was that not the thing? Was that, no?
It may have been part of the fee schedule, but, I mean,
So that would be something to look up. A lot of communities, they just go through code enforcement, but you'd want to know what your specific process is. So if somebody doesn't come to you when they were supposed to because they're in a locally designated district, or if you gave them a COA for one piece of work, but then they didn't follow it and they ended up doing something else, that kind of thing. So you'll want to check out your ordinance to see what it says about that. Know your design guidelines. We're not going to talk about this really because you don't have design guidelines yet. But if you establish them, you should know them inside and out. Know your historic resources. Even though you don't have a recent survey right now, I imagine since you all live here, you're probably somewhat familiar with the resources that are here. But familiarize yourself with the National Register listed properties. We already did that. There's 2. Identify what areas have been surveyed and those that have not. So what is the scope of the survey that's coming up?
The survey is going to study, it's going to survey all the buildings that are 50 years or older within our local district.
Okay, so like downtown?
Yes.
Okay, so you're going to survey an area that has been surveyed previously, that is kind of the heart of your community. But what you might want to consider in a couple of years is surveying an area that has not previously been surveyed. Maybe an area that's more mid-century resources, maybe an area that represents an underrepresented community, a minority community, but looking outside the Main Street kind of district. So just keeping an open mind that historic resources come in all shapes and sizes, and that you might want to expand beyond just the downtown district. Keep learning, and it's not necessarily just through trainings. If you're on social media in any capacity, I highly recommend that you follow the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions, that you follow our office, the Florida Division of Historical Resources, the Florida Trust, pages like that, because they frequently, I'm talking about our social media, Facebook, our website, and Instagram, we share current preservation events all the time that you may find interesting, that may be helpful to you in your work. Another thing, we have a Clg Listserv where folks in the other certified local government communities will send questions that their board is dealing with, and Trevor actually has sent them before. But if you guys have questions and you want to know how other communities in Florida are dealing with them, you can send it to me, and I can disseminate it to the other certified local governments, and they can give you feedback about how they've dealt with specific issues. But in terms of continuing to learn, if you wanted to as a board, I believe you can join the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions as a board. They do a big conference every 2 years. They call it a forum. They also have their own listserv that's got all kinds of interesting information all the time, and then they have a magazine. But finding ways to connect with other preservationists and just a way to continue learning and engaging in new things because there's always something more to learn. All right, educating the public. These are two, I have a, oh, do I have a copy of it? I think I have a copy. Yes. I'll pass this around. This is the image on the right, Historic District Design Review, a citizen's reference guide to historic district design review. I think this is just the coolest document. This is from the Lakeland CLG, and they developed it for citizens, for members of the public who have no experience with historic preservation but may own a historic home, and it walks them through everything about what it means to own a locally designated historic property. This is available online. I highly recommend you check it out. But this is a great example of how to educate the public about historic preservation and how it works, how to make it seem less threatening, and just to help them understand the process. I'll pass this around. But again, I highly recommend you look at the online version. And then on the left, the Historic Home Workshop flyer. This is an event that they've been doing, I think, for 10 years at least now. It's like a half-day event, and they bring in all kinds of speakers, and they even do like hands-on window workshops where you can repair a historic window. But it's another kind of public engagement event where they're getting people to come in and learn about historic preservation. They get to meet face-to-face with the staff members and preservation professionals, but you can get really creative with finding ways to educate the public. All right, so remember that your board is an arm of the local government. I'm sure you've heard about this before, but make sure you abide by sunshine and open meeting laws. Be careful with your email communications. Do not reply all. Avoid accidental meetings. So when a quorum is present and projects are discussed, you've actually if you have the quorum, you're having a meeting and you haven't noticed it. So be careful. If you are going to be doing a site visit before you're reviewing a project, again, making sure that if it is going to have a quorum present, that you notice it. Make sure you communicate with your city attorney often. A lot of boards will have the city attorney present for every single meeting. That can be helpful. Develop relationships and work closely with code enforcement, like we talked about previously. Code enforcement may be the one following through on COAs, or if folks are not following the procedures that you have outlined. So developing relationships with them can be very helpful to you in your work. And then involve your local elected officials whenever possible. You know, if you decided to have like a local historic preservation awards event, inviting local officials so they can be involved and learn about the good work that you're doing. Do your homework. So before your meetings, you should certainly read the staff report. If possible, you should visit the site without trespassing. Taking a look at it for yourself, it can make a world of difference when you look at a building up close than when you just see pictures. If you can't go see it, Google Street View is helpful. But again, seeing it at the human level from the street can make a big difference. And you'll also be able to look around at the rest of the street and see how changes to that one building are going to impact the character of the district, which is something we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. But do your homework. Carefully craft your motions. My coworker Ruben Acosta does like a 45-minute presentation on this slide alone. So we're not gonna go too deep into this, but for every motion that you make, you need to put reasons for the decision into the motion. So there's basically 4 parts in a motion. Identify your findings of fact, identify the criteria by which you're making the decision, which is typically the Secretary standards or your local design guidelines. Identify the scope of work that you're approving or denying, and then making the actual motion. So approving, denying, motion to approve with conditions, so on and so forth. And I just have an example here that breaks it down by color, each of the 4 components. So I find that the property at 2683 Monroe Street is a contributing resource to the Aliceville Historic District, so there's your finding of fact, and that the proposed replacement of 14 windows on the north, south, and west facades, which is part of your motion, is in compliance with the local historic district guidelines. As the new windows match the original in size, configuration, and proportion, therefore I move that we approve the applicant's request without conditions. So it doesn't have to be exactly like this, but basically you're looking for those 4 components in any motion that you make. And then this is one of the most important things that I hope you take home. You need to be objective and consistent in your decisions. So your decisions should be based on facts presented to the board, and your personal aesthetic judgments should be avoided. Let me say that again. Personal aesthetic judgments should be avoided. You should never say, I like that. That's pretty. I don't like that. You are focusing on objective information that you are given about the building and its historic character and the changes and how it will impact the character. So everything that you say in response to an application needs to be objective, and it needs to be framed in that language of the historic character and how the changes will impact the historic character.
Well, you should have been here our last meeting.
Oh, no.
We went through all these things just bullet by bullet by bullet.
I mean, I still catch myself. I'm like, ooh, I like that, but I just try to say it much quieter now. When reviewing historic designations, decisions should be based upon the current condition of the building and not future plans for a property that may or may not happen. So if someone comes to you and they want to designate their house and it's kind of, it's not in great shape, it's kind of run down, and they're telling you, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to replace the siding, put a rear addition, blah, 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 blah. You are making a decision about designating that property as it is in that moment. So not as it's going to be, not as the plans say it's going to be, it's as it is at this moment. If they then do a lot of work to it that kind of renders it, it can no longer convey its historic significance, or it is so different from what it was previously that it's no longer deserving of that designation, then you would probably remove the designation. But again, make the decision for designation based on how it is now, and not how they say it's going to be, because so many times those plans fall through or are never carried out. All right, and then lastly, like I said, encourage your city or county attorney to attend your meetings, because they can help kind of guide you to be objective and consistent. And then planning for preservation, again, I have an entire webinar on preservation planning. If you want to hear more about that, I can send it to you. But you should be thinking ahead, and I think that since you guys are a fairly new board, a fairly new CLG, you are planning ahead. You've got this survey that is then going to lead to other things. But you can plan in a couple of different ways. You can be kind of informal in terms of having a work plan, or it can be more formal in terms of having a historic preservation element of your comp plan, because then that kind of holds your local government accountable and making historic preservation a priority by having that element in your comp plan. So that's something to think about. And I have lots of examples that I could send to you if you wanted to see what other Florida communities are doing. And then some folks like St. Augustine do a massive standalone preservation plan. That takes a lot of time and effort and usually involves a consultant to develop that kind of a plan, but that is also an option. But things to plan for, application timelines for future grant projects. So if you decide after this survey, we want to do a National Register district, deciding, by which year you're going to apply for that grant and so on and so forth. Future surveys, future local designations, future National Register nominations, and educational and promotional projects, but just some things to think about for the future. All right. Do you guys want a break? Or do you just want to power through?
Whatever works for your voice.
Oh, I'm good now. This mint saved me. Thank you. I couldn't really talk this weekend, so this is good. All right, are we powering through, or you guys want a break?
Yeah.
Harvard.
Yes.
Okay, so this part, I'm going to talk much less, and you're going to talk much more.
No.
Yes, you are. All right. So we want to talk about design review because I think it's the aspect of being a board member that gives board members the most anxiety. It can be the trickiest part of the job. It can seem really subjective. And so we're just going to go through a couple of exercises to make it hopefully less scary. So the purpose of design review. And when I say design review, I'm talking about reviewing changes to a locally designated property. So someone wants to put a new roof on their house, which is in your local historic district. They have to come before your board to have it approved before they can do it. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about design review. So why do we do this? We do this to protect locally designated historic properties. We do design review to effectively manage the use and reuse of historic buildings. We do it to educate people about their buildings and their history. We do it to comply with federal, state, and local preservation requirements. Oh, it's covered up. Hopefully I'll know what it says. The purpose of design review is to ensure that any project involving a designated property is planned to protect the integrity, aka the historic character, of the property. So in order to talk about historic character, we have to know what historic character is. Is anyone here familiar with the preservation briefs? Anyone? Yes? Okay. The National Park Service has a series of what they call preservation briefs, and they are basically technical assistance documents about a whole range of topics. I think they have a preservation brief on putting solar panels on historic structures. They have a preservation brief on replacing historic windows, preservation brief on how to mothball a building. So if you're not going to renovate it for quite some time, but you want to protect it from the elements, how to keep it immune from water intrusion and animal intrusion and break-ins, things like that. There's at least 25 of them. They're great. If you Google National Park Service preservation briefs, it's the first thing that'll come up. I would pull it up here, but I'll lose my place. And I have a copy of number 17, which is what we're going to be referencing today. I'll pass it around if you want to. But when you're trying to identify the historic character in a building, we're going to break it down into these 7 categories. You're going to look at a building and you're going to say, okay, what is its shape? What is its roof form? What are the materials of the roof? How would I describe the roof? You're going to look at the openings in the building, meaning doors and windows, vents. You're going to look at projections, so porches, stairs, trim and secondary features, so what kind of embellishments are on this building. Materials, what is it made of? What's the siding made of? What are the windows made of? What's the roof made of? So on and so forth. And setting, what does the setting around the building look like? And I'm going to keep this on the screen with all of our upcoming examples, so you can look at them. The preservation brief expands upon it much more, but here's our little list. So we have a house. You all have a house in front of you. I want you to describe the historic character of this house by breaking it down into its parts. And just shout it out.
I was going to say bungalow style, 412 pitch on a roof. Looks like you've got a set of French doors in the front, main door, and I'm guessing another set of French doors on the right side.
How many stories is this building?
Single.
One. At least
like-
from what I can tell, anyway, one.
It's like 1.5, so it's got a low, kind of rectangular basic shape. So if you were to put a gigantic roof addition, you would very much alter the historic character of this building's shape. All right, what about the materials?
I'm guessing that's wood siding.
And then I think it's
Stucco.
Looks like
stucco
stucco.
over something on the porch. Does it have any projections?
Yes.
It's got the porch. It's got the exposed rafters under the thing. It's got beam projections coming out.
What about the setting?
Can't see much.
Well, based on what you can see.
I'd
It's
say
obviously not in a congested urban
It's
environment.
rural.
It's rural.
Yeah, there's no evidence of other buildings in the background.
Okay.
You don't have a driveway that's coming right up there, so you're not looking to see that it's actually right on a, if you will, a subdivision street.
It looks like there's a building in the back, which maybe, and it's hard to tell, you know, because you can't come around it, but it looks like there's something further back there
On
on
the
the left
left,
side.
I think it's just a piece of the building.
Could be.
Yeah, I can't remember if that's an addition or an outbuilding, but looking at outbuildings are important, if the outbuildings are historic or not. I want to come back to the porch for a second. So we say that having this porch is part of its historic character. I don't know if you can tell, but it used to be screened in. So those little wooden pieces
Vertical
there were
beams.
supporting the screen. So it would probably be appropriate for this to have a screened-in porch because historically it had one. What if they want to close it in?
Well, then you're changing the whole
It's changing
fabric
everything.
of the openings.
All right, that was one. Now let's go to another. And I'm not looking for architectural jargon or anything. Please, if you need to say that thing on the roof or whatever, that is totally acceptable. All right, so how would you break down the historic character of this building into its parts?
Rectangular building, 2-story. Matched openings of 4 panes.
Most likely a parapet roof or a shed-style roof with a parapet front.
Projection is the thing for the movie marquee.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like it's made out of stucco. Or
It's brick with stucco.
Masonry, yeah. Urban setting. Medallions and columns as trim features.
Any thoughts about the storefront?
It's on the left.
So if you'll notice, so it has like a central ticket window, where the box office is. We all know this is a theater. So the historic character of this building is intrinsically connected to the fact that it's a theater. So the marquee is very important to its historic character. The box office is very important. There's a little ticket window there, and then there's, the ticket window in the center. I'm not really familiar with theater architecture terminology, so sorry about that. But then you have also these storefronts. You have the picture window on the left, and if you notice, all the doors are recessed. With late 19th and early 20th century commercial districts, almost always the storefronts have a recessed entryway. And something that you might come up against, which I have come up against elsewhere, is that in order to maximize space, developers want to get rid of that recessed entryway and do it flush so they get more square footage. But for commercial districts from the late 19th and early 20th century, that recessed entryway is very important. All right, any other thoughts about the theater? Okay, we're going to go with some modern buildings. These are the Bacardi Buildings. They're in Miami. They actually sit on the same lot, but I don't have a picture. You can kind of see the shorter building in the background of the right photo, but this is a little bit more of a challenge, but using these criteria here, shape, roof, openings, projections, trim, secondary features, materials, and setting, how would you describe the historic character of this building, these buildings?
A floating rectilinear box.
With the mosaic.
They don't look historic to me.
There's no obvious roof, so
Flat roof.
flat roof.
So the one on the left is stained glass, and the one on the right is mosaic tile.
Right, and they actually, neither one of them look historic to me.
They are, though. They're on the National
Well,
Register.
they're not, I mean,
They look quite
they're not
modern.
traditional architecture is what you're saying.
So
Right.
these were
like
actually
postmodern or something,
listed
wasn't
under criterion G, which is basically an allowance you can make for buildings that are slightly under 50 years of age, but are so significant that they warrant listing before they turn 50. I think they're like 48 years old, but they were listed for their architecture and their affiliation with the Bacardi Company. All right, but let's get back to the buildings themselves.
Really no obvious openings. And that, at least on the one, when we're talking about the one on your left as you're looking at the screen.
I
So
think
they have
there's,
artwork on the side.
So the projection is actually the building itself. And as far as trim or secondary features, it's actually all the art is the element that you're looking at for that. Materials is too hard to say. I mean, you indicated it was stained glass, so that gives us, you know, that. I mean, if I were looking at it, I couldn't tell you whether it was stained glass or whether it was you know, tile.
Like tile.
And that's one of the, I mean, like we mentioned earlier, that's why it can be really important for you to visit a building in advance so you can look at it closely and get a better idea beyond what you've been given in the staff notes and in the application. You can kind of see for yourself and make a personal assessment. One thing I would point out is that these are on a, I'm lacking vocabulary right now. They're on a base with open space. And so you, if the applicant wanted to fill in that space, probably wouldn't be appropriate. All right. You may be working with modern buildings. You never know.
I don't, it depends. I mean, if you just guess not being appropriate for closing in the one on the left, I guess what my point would be, what's the historic element of it? Is it the shape of the building or is it the significance of the art? And if it's the significance of the art, closing in the base, so long as it doesn't outshine or compete with the artistic, with the artistic element of that, could be it could be appropriate.
Right, but the artistic element of the building isn't just limited to the stained glass and the mosaic tile. It's also the design of the building. And this,
If the importance of it is the fact that it's a floating structure.
Yes.
Then yes, but.
it is important. I read this nomination. That's an important.
And that's fine. I mean, from a design
Sure.
argument, could be said that because of the base is bright orange underneath, that it's no longer floating because that base draws too much attention and shows how it's held in place. So it's no longer floating. It's it's like falling water, Franklin right. Those cantilever elements are floating because you don't really see how they're being held up. In this case, again, it's all art. And
But what if it's always
architecture.
been orange?
If it's always been orange, then, that case can be made, but I'm just saying. you
I mean,
have to
there's look at those.
there's no right or wrong.
Oftentimes with design review, you're going to have to make the best decision that you can with the standards, with the Secretary of Standards, what you know about the project, what you know about the history of the building. It's not always going to be a clear-cut answer. So getting used to having discussions about the historic character of the building and how changes would impact it is going to be very helpful to you.
It seems a big part of our job is to maintain the historical integrity of the building. And so to enclose that thing destroys the historical integrity of the building.
Good.
I mean,
So a lot of times, one of the main reasons properties are removed from the National Register is because they lose integrity. So if they tore off the mosaic from the side and filled in the bottom of the cantilevered structure, there would be a case to remove it from the National Register because it lost the integrity under which it was listed. So you make a really great point. All right, now we're going to look at a collection of buildings. So we have 4 commercial buildings in a downtown commercial district right next to each other. And if you want to, you can talk about the historic character of the individual structures, but try to look at them as a grouping and the character of that particular grouping of 4 buildings. Tell me about the materials.
all
Brick.
brick, similar size and shape. Similar number of openings for windows, commercial storefronts.
Each of them has what you would call a 3-bay facade, where you can break it down into 3 basic sections with the windows. You can see that I think 2 of them have filled in their recessed entryway. No, but they did it.
Oh, they did.
All of them have arched windows on the upper story.
They all have flat roofs.
I think 2 of them have awnings. The tree makes it hard to tell on the right. But they, over time, probably all had awnings at certain times and didn't have awnings at other times. But looking at these buildings, they're not cookie cutter exactly the same. They don't have to be the same. Let's say the one with the blue awning, I don't know, gets hit by a large tree or crumbles, whatever, it's gone. The one with the blue awning, imagine that it's now vacant, and a developer's purchased that lot and they want to construct a new building. What are some things you would want to see based on the character that exists between the other 3 buildings? Same materials, same or similar materials.
Same 3-bay concept.
A 3-bay facade would be very helpful.
Same kind of window.
Consistent height,
Flat roof. I mean.
flat roof.
I think if they're gonna redo it, they're probably gonna try not to keep that same recessed outlet with the door. If they don't keep that same recessed outlet because they're rebuilding, then the doors the other ones chose, I think, should be similar so that they would be matching.
So they wouldn't necessarily have to do a recessed entryway like was historic, because it's not a historic building, it's a new building. But they don't want it to be so distinct and so different from the rest that it draws all of your attention to it. It's like one of these things is not like the other. So you do want some consistency, but you're not also trying to pretend that a new building is an old building. All right, we're going to do a similar example with a residential property. All right, we have 3 little houses. What are some of the things that you think define the historic character of these buildings?
They're all shotgun homes.
Single-story shotguns.
Front porches.
Porches are all of them.
the roofs all look like they are made of
Metal.
metal.
Mm-hmm. They all have front-facing gables. You can't see it in this image, but they're all on, well, you can see it in the center. They're all on pier
piers.
foundations.
Well, that's typical for a shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
And Florida.
The
One's
roofs are
all-
the same, the design of the roofs are basically the same.
Yeah, they all have the porch roof kind of tucked under the main roof.
They're all made of, are they all made of wood?
Mm-hmm. Wood siding. Well, the middle one might have some asbestos siding on top of it.
Yeah,
or-
it looks like the shingle style, asbestos style.
All right, any other thoughts about the historic character of these buildings? All right, we're going to get a little bit more advanced on this one. So we're going to look at the house on the far right, the one with the wheelchair ramp. This is when the wheelchair ramp was removed. I apologize. All right, but the owner of this house, which is in a locally designated historic district, is coming before your board with the following proposed work. They want to do some work to the CMU piers, concrete masonry unit piers underneath the house. They want to replace some windows. They want to replace a front door. They want to replace damaged siding. They want to add a wood picket fence. And they want to create an addition of they want to add a screened porch to the rear of the building. So first of all, what questions do you have about these changes before you can make a decision?
What kind of work you need to do on the CMU piers?
Sure, yeah.
What are you replacing the windows with? Mm-hmm. What are you replacing the front door with? Mm-hmm. Is the damaged siding you're replacing going to be consistent with the rest of the structure?
And how much siding are you replacing?
Yep. Wood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very important question.
Then the wood picket fence, are we talking a perimeter fence, or are you talking about the rails up on front?
Good question. All right. So we've asked some questions. Here's what they did. What do you think? Do you think that the changes that they made altered the historic character of the house detrimentally or positively?
The posts are different.
I think the posts do. I don't think the posts are the same. Like, they don't keep that same feel. The other one feels different.
Well, and one question that you could have asked previously is, were the rails on that porch historic in the first place? And what kind of condition were they in? I mean, they don't always have to retain historic materials. Obviously, you want to retain them when you can. But if they weren't historic to begin with, or if they were in bad shape and weren't, going to meet ADA standards or whatever, and they needed to replace them, you could understand that. What do you think about the fence?
I don't have any issue with the fence. I don't think we have any.
Is it actually tied into the building itself? I mean, up in the front, it looks like it might go up to the
railing.
railing to the steps, but around the other side, it doesn't look like it's actually tied into the porch.
I'm not really sure. Some communities have guidelines about fences, so if you were to create design guidelines specifically for St. Cloud, that might be something that you'd want to elaborate on, because the Secretary of Standards, as we'll go through them in a second, they don't have criteria about fences. So a lot of communities will say, like, okay, you can have a picket fence, but there needs to be 2 inches between each picket or whatever. It can't be a solid fence that blocks the view of the house or something like that. But if you make design guidelines, you can you can get into really specific changes to houses if you wanted to.
So I've got a question. The image we've got here,
Uh-huh.
is that the house in its original state?
Right, the top slide?
The one right here?
That's
Before
amidst the changes, because they've torn off the handicap.
Okay, so
taken
the
the
ADA
ADA
came off, and then the railing out front for the porch came off as well? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So with the fencing though, because isn't that something that could be changed, so it wouldn't necessarily really change the characteristic of it? Because like paint doesn't, like you can change paint colors.
Right. I mean, and that's something you have to decide. So like some communities regulate paint color. You don't have to regulate paint color. I look at paint color as a temporary change that's reversible. So let people choose the colors for their house. That's my personal opinion.
Again, it goes
Fences-
back to the integrity of the building. The paint doesn't change the integrity of the building, nor does the fence, because it's not part of the building.
Right. It can be removed, if it can be removed without damaging the structure, okay. And if it's not detracting from the historic character of the building in terms of being able to see it and its historic features, okay. But these are decisions you're gonna have to make as a group, in terms of what you think is appropriate. And, you know, design guidelines may be very helpful for you in that, in analyzing these specific aspects of properties and how they can change and adapt. I did just want to mention about the CMU piers. Some of the piers were historic brick, and so they just tried to shore those up and keep those, and then they also added additional support elsewhere. That's perfectly acceptable, you know, trying to make sure that the house isn't sinking in all different ways, but also maintaining the historic piers.
Was it
And
raised?
they did not raise
Okay,
it.
it looks higher. It does look higher.
That's a great
It
question.
does.
It
And
looks higher.
I have a
There's more
question.
steps.
Where does safety and functionality of those piers
Oh, that's priority.
intersect with historic function?
That's always going to come first. Safety is always going to come first.
Because where I lived in Alaska, and this would have never been allowed under a house, never. And so the thought of a house sitting on piers, it makes me almost go into cardiac arrest.
Well, you also have to think about Florida flooding.
I understand.
Right, and so you want the piers to be structurally stable so that this house.
Correct.
Yeah, so that's, you can't tell them no to making their house safe so that it's not going to collapse.
No, but they need to be as safe as possible with
Yeah.
whatever material is
And if there's
under
no
there.
way, if they can prove to you that there's no way they can save the historic materials, then they may have to replace all the piers, and sometimes that's just gonna be the scenario, but you have to take every scenario individually.
Individually.
So I can only kind of make up scenarios here, but,
Okay.
but safety
I
is.
apologize
No,
for
no.
being so reactive.
No, I mean, yeah, that makes me nervous when you look at the before photos and you see the piers.
Could I say a couple things? To your point on the piers, what sometimes you can do is, since it's the front of the building, you ask them to take the piers or whatever, if they can't replace them, put the authentic stuff in the front, and then put new stuff in the rear. Yeah, you gotta be careful with lap siding, because sometimes these older buildings have been redone, so they might be 8-inch and 6-inch, so somebody's gotta do some research to find out which is the right size lap siding. The columns, you know, these columns, it doesn't fit the other homes that are there, so this probably, in my professional opinion, would not be, I would have a problem with that. And then the fence, we had an issue with the fence in Kissimmee where there was a historic home, and the fence was a picket fence, but it was only 3 feet tall. And the reason for that was the doctor wanted to keep his chickens in, so it was only 3 feet tall, so the kids could still play with it and stuff like that. So we made a point of saying if they want to put a picket fence, it would have to be at least 3 feet tall. It couldn't be the 4-foot or 6-foot fences. So that's kind of stuff that we experienced. And back to your thing about the pedestals, whether it's pedestals, doors, columns, if there's some other stuff around the building on the rear side that can be used to bring forward to the front of the building for, you got to look at that too.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you all have design guidelines?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I need
we
to-
have three communities.
Uh-huh.
With the downtown, and then we have 2 others, and we have guidelines for all of them.
That's
So
awesome.
We learned quite a bit about, especially doors. This particular door on this one, I don't think we would have approved that one, because if you look at the original door, it had a screen door and it had a door, so we would want them to at least put a screen door in front of it, that sort of thing, so.
And
Yeah,
the-
I was going to make the point that it actually lacks a screen door, which is typical for shotguns, because you would leave the door open, the screen there to allow for the air circulation through, because that was the whole point of the shotgun, was drawing air through the shotgun to cool it down.
The community that I drew this example from, which is a Florida community, they actually, in their design guidelines, had a door and window schedule. So they said, these are the door types that are
That are
appropriate
acceptable.
for this type of house. These are the window types that are acceptable for this type of house. Again, something you can get really deep into if you decide to create design guidelines.
And in this case, when we were talking about the columns and the, if you will, the railings, and that's just the architectural element of that, I don't believe that, in my opinion, that the columns are really inappropriate because they stay simple, which is what you're seeing. When you went back to the first picture where you had the 3 across there, the one that had the addition of the carport, if you look, you have round columns, which probably were not original to the building, obviously, when they built the carport, which is probably an add-on, then it came in there. I would tend to say that a squared-off column as opposed to round, and instead of having the spindles be turned, it was most likely, if there was no other ornamentation, you probably wouldn't have had ornamentation on your spindles either. They would have been just simple square spindles. So again, looking at what their design guidelines would have been very helpful, and that's
Sure.
understanding of that.
And this is an example of where understanding the historic context of how these houses and the community surrounding them developed would help you understand the houses themselves, because shotgun houses are most frequently from working class communities, often African American communities in low-lying areas. So these houses are on piers because it was the land that African Americans were allowed to purchase. So it was not desirable land. They also were being paid significantly less than their white counterparts wherever it is that they were working. And so these houses were often constructed piece by piece over time with whatever materials they could find. So in evaluating houses, it is oftentimes very important that you consider how these houses developed in the first place, who occupied them, what character are you trying to preserve? Are you trying to preserve the memory of this working class community? Things like that. So that history does come into play when you're evaluating properties, so it's something to think about.
And the context in which they sit,
Yes.
and the history of the area. Thank you.
Well, one of the reasons too you'd have a house up on piers in Florida in particular is to get airflow into the
Yes.
house to keep it cool, because there wasn't any air conditioning back then.
Oh, no.
But the piers are certainly a character defining feature of these houses. So you would definitely want to keep, what would you say if they wanted to enclose the piers and make it a solid foundation? Have you had examples like this?
Yes, we would not.
And they,
What we did is we came up with the criteria that you could enclose underneath there, because we saw some examples in the past of using a type of lattice
Yeah.
that goes around, but that was the limit of it, the criteria.
Again, something you could include in design guidelines.
Right.
If people want to put some kind of blocking between the piers, is it going to be lattice where it's removable and still airflow can get beneath there? But things that you can determine. All right. Are you all familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards? Have you at least been introduced to them?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to go through them briefly. Have you seen, well, okay. This is like the full version, book version. They were recently updated, I think a couple of years ago. But you can get this online. There are 4 standards, 4 sets of standards: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. What you guys will primarily be working with are rehabilitation cases. So preservation is when you are just keeping a building exactly like it is right now. Not going to change it, not going to update it to have, air conditioning, whatever. Like, you're just going to keep it exactly as it is in this moment. Restoration is when you decide, okay, this building's 300 years old. It had a big renovation 100 years ago. I want to take it back to what it looked like when it was built. And so you take off any modern additions, any changes, and you take it back to a very particular period. That's what a restoration is. Rehabilitation is the flexible use. This is when you want to preserve as much historic material as possible, but you want it to be used. You want someone to be able to live in it or work in it. And so there's some flexibility there about changes you can make. And then lastly, reconstruction is fairly self-explanatory. It's when a building's been lost and you try to replicate it by rebuilding it. So we're going to talk about the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. All right, so the main idea of all of the standards, there's 10 of them, is that work should retain and restore as much historic fabric and features as possible. It should retain historic character, which you are all now experts on, and that any changes should be compatible and reversible. All right, the first standard, this is the adaptive reuse standard. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. And so I have 3 properties here that all initially had one function and have been adaptively reused to be something else. So top left is an old cotton mill. It is now loft housing. The one in the center was once a gas station and then an auto parts store, and it's now a bar. And the one on the bottom right is an old firehouse that is now a restaurant. And they've all been changed in order to adapt to new purposes, but they've retained their historic character. All right, standard number 2. The historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. There are 2, these are the same buildings, believe it or not. There are 2 major changes that destroyed the historic character of the building. Can you see what they are?
Painting of the brick.
They painted the brick. This building went 100 years being unpainted brick, and then it was painted. It had become part of the historic character that it was unpainted, exposed brick, and it was a very nice-looking brick. All right, what's the second change?
Did they change the windows, or is that just the windows?
Yes, they did change the windows. They ripped out the entire front. No more recessed entryways, no more historic entrances. They sort of tried to maintain that 3-part piece with the transom windows, the store windows, and the bulkhead, but there's no recessed entryway anymore. So maintain the historic character of a property. Standard 3, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. Do you see what happened here? This was a plain commercial building, just brick commercial building. And they added like some neoclassical columns and pediment. All right, standard 4. Most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. Okay, so we're going to talk about the green building in the middle that looks like it's sheet metal. This used to be a 3-part brick commercial structure. It's 100 and something years old. In the 1930s, it was purchased by somebody who turned it into a movie theater. And so they wanted to update it inexpensively and modernly to kind of bring it up to look like a movie theater. So they put the new material on the storefront, they put the sheet metal looking stuff on the top, and then they put the little spire at the top. Regardless of whether or not you like this, has it perhaps acquired historic significance in its own right?
Well, it's over 50 years.
Well, it's over
Yes.
50 years, and it kind of looks like that, like art, not really Art Deco, but like that time frame in like the 50s where it was like more like, I don't know, looks like Roswell to me. So I think that's probably historical on its own significance.
So if the owner came to your board and they wanted to take the sheet metal off, what would you say?
What's underneath the sheet metal?
Right.
I don't know, I think that I would have to say, no, you can't take the sheet metal off, because once they take that sheet metal off, it's gonna totally change whatever's behind it.
Well,
And I will say, I don't know that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer here. You would need to know a lot about the circumstances.
if they could demonstrate the fact that underneath that sheet metal, when that was applied, there was minimal damage to the original facade of the brick and everything else, and then when that comes off, that you can actually restore it and actually have it fit into the character of the remaining district, then I wouldn't have a problem with that per se, because it's a different period of time. If, because of when that was redesigned in the 30s and whatever happened in the 30s or 40s or whatever became significant from a historical event standpoint, then you have an argument to keeping it. But again, it's the what ifs and what fors that you're actually looking at that have to be brought to us to understand.
It would also change the standards you're using. Because right now we're using rehabilitation. If you did that, you'd have to go back to restoration.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, and there'd have to be some research done before a determination could be made.
And they could come to you and say, like, there's water damage. Like, we think that this sheet metal, it's not sheet metal, I don't know what it is trapping water, and now it's inundating the building, and we have no choice but to take it off and figure out what the problem is. There could be all these circumstances. This is not an easy one. I keep checking, like the minutes of the board in this community. This is in Georgia. And I just want to know if this building's ever going to come up against their board asking to have the sheet metal taken off. All right, standard 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a historic property shall be preserved. Pay attention to the detail and the fine craftsmanship on a building. Again, another reason why it's important to visit the site, because you may not notice those things in the photos on an application. Standard 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires the replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. I have a picture of a window here because a lot of times, and you will probably have this happen, people will come to you with an argument that they want to get all new energy efficient windows. And what historic preservationists will tell you is that probably the most energy efficiency is being lost through your insulation in the ceilings and the floors. You can install storm windows on the inside, but if at all possible, you can prevent somebody from removing their historic windows unnecessarily. It's amazing the difference that windows make when they've been replaced. I mean, you can tell when that glass is new. But definitely, if you can find ways to incentivize and encourage people to keep their historic windows, that definitely impacts the character.
How do we know, from our limited knowledge of the property, whether that window has deteriorated to a point where it can't be replaced?
You would ask them to provide that evidence, like photos, like if there's water, if they're saying that there's water getting in, like they need to show where the water damage is, mold, things like that. But they are making a case. They have to provide you with the evidence for why they need to do something that would damage the historic character. And you can also, you would need to make sure you're doing it within sunshine laws, but you could also visit the site.
We ran into this across the street with the hotel and some of that, but and the brick pictures is kind of what brought it up. Mm-hmm. If they have to replace brick, to find this kind of brick is almost impossible now. To actually physically, piece deteriorate and you have to replace that piece of brick. Where are you going to find that maker of brick anymore without it looking like a little patchwork in the building? We ran up against this and we're kind of trying to think about what are you going to do about this.
Are you talking about in terms of identifying appropriate replacement materials?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this brick they don't make anymore. A lot of it was soft brick that deteriorates and you can't find anymore. So.
Well, that's a great question. I would need to pull the Clg Listserv to see. I think actually there might have been an email recently about brick manufacturers that try to mimic historic brick. I'll have to go back and look. But sometimes it's just not, you're not going to be able to replace it with historic brick, but you can try to find the next best thing, and it's not always going to be perfect. But that is something that I'll look up when I get back and see if folks are...
Again, you find areas of the building that may have the brick, and then that is not seen by the public, or that can be removed and then just replaced, used for the front, and then whatever brick you can find as close as possible in the areas that aren't seen as much. The AIA has a historic preservation resource that, to your point, they were talking about the brick, that a lot of the brick manufacturers are starting to mimic, like she said, the brick. So it's getting better. I don't know how expensive it is, but there again, you got to look at the building as a total and see what you can reuse and replace it in areas that is not seen. I guess that's the proper way of saying it.
Yeah. So this brick slide here for standard 7, chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Sandblasting is the opposite of gentlest means possible. Not only does it change the appearance of the brick, but it degrades the integrity and the strength of the brick. As you can see on the right-hand side, this is the same wall. The hard outer layer of that brick has been completely removed by the sandblasting. The interior of that brick is much softer material. It is much more susceptible to moisture. And so what's going to happen is that brick is slowly, probably not that slowly, erode over time. The mortar has also been lost, but it really, truly damages the physical integrity of that building. So with sandblasting, this is not just an aesthetic thing. I mean, you may lose that building in the long run because of an aesthetic choice. So sandblasting is almost never, ever okay. Standard 8, significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. So just don't forget about archaeology. If folks encounter, remains or artifacts in the course of doing work to their properties, work needs to pause. And that's the point in time that you would want to contact the Bureau of Archaeological Research. All right, standard 9, new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So what you have in this image is the main historic building on the left, the big block. You have what's called a hyphen, that glass kind of buffer, and then on the right you have the addition. And so this is an example of an addition that is distinct from the main building, but it uses similar materials, similar windows, and then it's differentiated by this hyphen. And the hyphen is twofold. The hyphen helps to differentiate the main building from the addition, but it also protects that main building because they didn't have to carve as much into that building in order to make the hyphen. So hyphens are often used in that capacity to help protect the main building so that if it was removed, there would be much less damage. New additions, standard 10, new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. All right, so we are going to do an example for an addition, and we're going to do 2 examples of new construction, and then we'll be done. So a couple of things to think about when you're evaluating a property for compatibility with its new addition. Some considerations. What will the removal of the addition in the future cause in terms of damage to the historic materials and character-defining features? Where is the addition going to be? How visible is it from the street? Is it differentiated yet compatible and harmonious with the original structure? Does it use a hyphen? Is it differentiated by size, scale, and massing? Are the materials the same or different? And how does the form and alignment compare to the historic building? And then you also need to consider the impact on the site and the setting. Inherent in all of the guidance is the concept that an addition needs to be subordinate to the historic building. All right, we have a house. It is on a corner lot. Go back, here's the front. The side. What do we think the character-defining features are of this building before we move forward?
Columns.
It's got some columns.
It's craftsman style.
Craftsman style.
Mm-hmm.
Front rails distinctive, wood siding, pitch of the roof, looks like asphalt shingles.
Single chimney from the looks of it.
Yeah.
All right, so keep those things in
It
mind.
basically looks like an L shape too.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's just a box with a porch.
I think it's a box with an extended porch,
Yeah.
gabled porch,
Looks like it's got some kind of rear porch.
and a deck in the back.
Got a deck.
All right. Here are the plans that they bring to you. They are proposing to put 2 additions on this house. A smaller one on the left and a slightly larger one on the right. Keep in mind, this is on a corner lot. What are your thoughts about these additions?
The gable on the porch is a different material. The railing around the porch has been taken down.
I think that might just be, well, we'll see in a second.
It's probably just, it could be just the elevation, but they maintained the windows from the front entry facade. From the side facade, they do not maintain the consistency as far as the window numbering and, pattern. So I would probably look at wanting, if they were to go forward that way, to be more consistent with the window repetition.
So they had windows here, but on the
But
side
there
addition, there's no
yeah, they went
windows.
from having double windows to single windows, and then they eliminated one of them.
Shutters have come off too.
I think that's just,
Are
I
they
think they
shutters?
stay in the final product. I think it was.
Yeah, but if I'm reviewing,
Yeah, but
Yeah, yeah.
this is what I'm looking at.
That's a
But
very
there's only
important question
shutters
to
on one-
ask, yes.
There's only shutters on one point, on one portion of that.
They got them here and they got them on the side.
Okay.
So they tried to differentiate the additions from the historic structure by recessing them beneath the main roof line, so A for effort. Any other thoughts about this addition? Do you think you'd approve it?
They've put another expansion over where the deck is in the back.
Well, yeah, I think so. I can't remember if it was there and you just couldn't see it in the photo.
I think you couldn't see it because the site plan has it poking out the back.
Okay.
I don't think we could see it from where we were, but
Oh my gosh, no, my slide's gone. Okay, they approved it, and my next photo was supposed to be the picture. Anyway, moral of the story is, this was a real Florida CLG, and they did approve it, so. All right, let's talk about new construction. Some considerations when thinking about new infill development or new construction in a neighborhood. Consider the architectural styles that are in the surrounding area. Take a look at the rhythm of the street as it exists, the scale of buildings, height, orientation to the street. Do they face the street themselves, or do they have like a side entrance? Setbacks from the street. Do they all have a uniform setback from the road? And then the details and materials. Okay, we have a vacant lot, a parking lot in a commercial district. Here you can see the vacant lot from across the street. So it's that parking lot right there. You can see that there's a row of some small 1.5 story commercial buildings to the left, and then you've got some 2.5 story, well, 3.5 story commercial buildings on the right across the street. These are the 1 story buildings to the left of the lot. These are the 3.5 on the right. These are the buildings across the street, so 2 story. It's got kind of a variety of scale going on. How are these, how would you describe the historic character of this intersection based on what I've shown you? These buildings, these
this
buildings.
is all brick.
These, all brick.
Commercial district, very, if you will, box, flat roof, parapet. You're getting a mixture of rhythms as far as for the upper floors. But all of the lower floors are appearing to be storefront
Okay.
with a mixture of loss as far as from recessed versus non-recessed.
All right.
Mixture of canopies.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Didn't want to cut you off, sorry.
No, I was just saying just a mixture of canopies from some of the different areas that you were showing.
Okay. So the owner of the vacant lot has decided it's time to develop. This downtown is booming. So I want to build a loft complex with some storefronts. What do you think of this drawing? How do you think it blends with the historic character of the district? And are there ways that it really isn't secondary and subordinate and kind of detracts?
It maintains the brick. It maintains the box structure. It's within the height limitations of the area. I mean, the only thing to me that doesn't really match is the windows are square versus having an arch on them.
Sure.
But that's,
And that might
Actually-
be okay because they're trying to they're not trying to pretend to be a historic building, so there can be some differentiation. It's trying to decide where the line is.
Yeah, but
There's
in
something
doing
about
that,
the
they're-
rhythm between the different facades of the historic.
So right to the left of this building will be those one-story commercial buildings, and then right across the street, and you'll see this in a second, will be those three-story commercial buildings.
Right.
So it'll be an interesting rhythm, but
I think
Is
they've
it-
lost the rhythm. It's actually a lack of rhythm across that in comparison to what you have on the street, especially down at the ground level, and actually the whole thing, all three stories. And that it's very flat. They may have recesses coming in, but they do not have any architectural detailing that's happening. That's going from the floor all the way to the roof line, which you're really seeing much more of in the other existing structures in the district. So I would have a tendency to say that it's, if you will, it's a little too modern and lacking of detailing.
so based on the plans that the drawing that we've been given here, it seems like there's a lack of detail that seems to be inherent to the buildings around it. The rhythm is a very challenging piece, and that's kind of why I chose this as an example, because if someone wants to develop that lot, they're probably not going to develop them. They're probably not going to want to develop them as one-story commercial buildings. And so deciding, is it okay that the buildings across the street are 2 stories and the building across the other street is 3 stories, deciding what rhythm is going to be acceptable.
I guess what I would say in regards to that is, again, you're looking at how even across the street and down the street, you don't have one solid continuity
Right.
of architectural feature. So they could have done architecture detailing to make it feel like this one building is actually multiple buildings
That's a great point.
across there.
That was Richard, that's the point that you articulated it better than I
Yeah.
could.
And I mean, it's just, they do it on all the townhomes. I mean, it drives me nuts to see a townhome that's got 5 different facades. Each 25-foot section or 20 section is a totally different color, different material. It's just like,
I know.
but from a standpoint in a commercial district, it still has that. Actually, City of Kissimmee, I know, has requirements in their CRA district as far as what they're expecting from an architectural, the fenestrations and my brains are going as far as, whether you have columns or recesses and that kind of thing, so you don't have a blank of a straight flat wall
Yeah.
for a set distance, which you don't have in this district here.
All right, so they've come back to you. They've made a change in their plans. Can you see what it is?
Oh, they
The
did.
brick bands?
You mean they've gone from trying to portray it as a old building in
They
their
added
first rendering?
They added another story.
Yes.
It's a parking lot on the 2nd floor. It's an open-air parking lot on the 2nd floor.
And did they add arches over the windows? Or
Yes.
They added arches.
They
Wow.
did.
They did.
Yes.
They added detailing.
They added
Actually, if
arches.
you look
No,
at the
this one
brick,
has
if you look
the-
at the brick pattern, it's there in the first one as
Yeah.
well,
It's hard
but
to see.
but it doesn't read at the
Oh,
windows.
okay. I see.
Right.
All right.
And here they've just changed, like I said, it's really just a change in the style of the rendering more than anything else. Yeah, it's added a floor, but I
Yeah.
mean, when you're looking
And-
at that,
I don't remember seeing the little patios on the,
yeah,
they were there, but they didn't pop out like, it's because of the blue trim.
their awnings and stuff have lost detail in this rendering.
Yeah.
In that case, but it's hard to see what's actually happening on that 2nd floor that you're saying is
Is
an
parking.
automobile parking. So if we're saying that we can actually see through that, so we're going to see the cars up on the 2nd floor because that's railing with open panels.
I don't think it goes not that the other one went very well, but I think now when you add that 4th floor, I think it's really going to make it even stick out more like a sore.
Well, what
I was
they've
going to say,
also,
the first one was better to me than this one.
Yeah.
what they
Yeah.
also, what they've
Yeah.
also done is if you look in the first one, you can see where they still have the single-story buildings adjacent to them. You've got that hint of it in there for scale. And the new one, they've kind of pretty
Yeah.
much
Yep.
done away
Yeah.
with
It
it.
just,
So you don't see the fact that they've,
Just
you know,
forget about those little
Yeah.
buildings next door.
So then when you put this in context, it's going to be the largest mass there because it's going to actually significantly outmass the single stories. And it's going to compete pretty well with the 2 and 3 stories across the street.
And
But
it's
isn't
gonna
there
look
something,
really out of scale.
It is a clever way to hide the parking, though.
It is.
If
So
that's
you're
not
losing a whole
open,
parking lot.
if that's not open, but if those aren't just like window treatment, if you will, faux windows and openings, and you actually, it's truly open air, and you're gonna see the vehicles back there, you're gonna see the people walking around there, it's going to look very, very weird.
But it brings up a question, though, and I'm thinking of downtown here, St. Cloud, is that could this possibly, maybe 4 stories is not good or it's dominant, but is it addressing a downtown issue of parking, a concern in a way that maybe we're looking at one picture, but maybe in real life, we might not see the cars in the parking as much or what have you. It actually could be helping out the downtown area. I think there's some questions to ask about that, because we have that issue here with where we're going to park, or are we going to have a parking lot or a ramp? But maybe this in some way aesthetically addresses additional need for parking?
I mean, it's all a balance, because you want people frequenting your downtown and you want them to have a place to park, but at the same time, you're trying to preserve the historic character that drew them there in the first place.
And you can also
So-
require them to actually put the garage onto the back half and keep the front element, the facade elements as residential, so that you're not creating just one floor of parking that's air gapping, if you will.
Right. I have a concern if it was the entire floor about the emissions from the vehicles getting into either residential units or business offices.
Valid concern.
And, I mean, CO is CO, and I just don't think, from a health standpoint, it's necessarily a good
that's probably the-
idea.
So,
That's probably the
next
reason
picture.
for the open air. That's probably the reason for those big openings, to flush it with air.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that Alan just brought up was a really good point. I know that we've discussed it as far as specifically to downtown. One of the things that building is addressing that I know in this era, kind of a lot of people talk about when we're revitalizing downtown areas, that we look at residential housing, because, you know, they say millennials want residential housing, and that could help economic development and spur that too. So is that particular structure providing residential homes that are not there in that area anyway that could help to rebuild the downtown area?
Are you referring to mixed-use spaces, Bobby? Is it-
Mixed-use space, yes, mixed-use spaces,
Yeah.
thank you. That's what I'm-
If they were reasonably priced, where millennials could afford them.
Well, I mean, it's a good, Bobby, you bring up a good point, because if you look at the people who work from home these days, that's why mixed-use spaces are on the rise.
Well, all these concerns that you're raising, I hate to beat a dead horse, but design guidelines can be very, very helpful to you in dealing with these things on the front end, rather than someone having an application in front of you and making a decision that could then impact future applications downtown. So deciding for yourselves, are you going to have height restrictions? Are you going to have requirements for elements of the facade? So does it need to vary if it's going to be a larger building? Does it not need to be a block, but need to be varied in the facades? If there needs to be specific detailing on the front, things like that. So the more you can kind of embrace that on the front end of things, the better. They built it.
Yep.
With the parking deck on the second floor. You can see how its scale compares to the 2 commercial buildings next to it across the street. Here's how it compares with the buildings across the street. Here's an aerial view.
I think your aerial actually gives you more information that we didn't have before, because if you look
Yes.
at the massing and the blocks in and around it, the single story actually are an anomaly.
Yeah,
Yes,
so say it fits in.
So you messed with us.
it fits in.
You need to go visit the site and look around at everything around you, because
It's
there's a lot you
approved.
can miss from the picture.
Across the way, you've got a 3 building, or that looks like a 4 building over there in that little parking lot, so it really does fit in.
Well,
It does fit in.
I think I got the idea of the parking, because this was a parking lot, and you just took all that parking out to do this building, so you're gonna have to replace it somehow or another. So where are the residents gonna park? So that's probably how they addressed it.
And we have more residential units.
Yeah.
Here it is at street level. How do you feel about the
No
materials and
awnings.
detailing?
They
Looks
took the
handsome.
awnings off.
I think it looks great.
I think it's okay.
It's nice.
This was literally just finished also, so they may not have installed the awnings, it's possible.
I like it better without the awnings.
Where
I know
is
we're not
this?
supposed to like.
This is in Georgia.
I think it fits more without
Anybody
the
mentioned
awnings.
is the horizontalness of this, because it's still a four-story building, and it has a lot of horizontal lines to it, and it's interesting that nobody mentioned that, because all the other old buildings had the canopies, which are thick overhangs, and a lot of the windows making horizontal lines. So that was my concern with the first picture, is there were no horizontal lines. The second picture had a lot more horizontal lines and allowed with it brought a lot more of it out.
Well, I was thinking to
And
Richard,
it kind of brought it down a little bit.
I was thinking to Richard's point about the breaking it up. All these buildings had vertical elements, and those vertical elements weren't replicated anywhere along here.
All right, let's see if I had one more picture.
It looked very functional.
You have a little bit of, you have a little bit of this as you're looking down there to where you're getting your if you will, your plaster to help break up the segments, but
All right, one more
be
example.
interesting to see it at night as to how much light pumps out of that
That's a good
parking area
question.
because of light requirements for parking garages.
Oh, that's a great question.
Would be a good question and a good thing to look at also and to consider.
It's your horizontal light band.
Well, we have a new lighting ordinance which
Yeah.
addresses that, so.
We're gonna do one more example and then I will set you free. Here we have a little house also on a corner lot. Here's the front. Here are its neighbors. Couldn't get a picture of all of them together, but here are its neighbors. What would you say are the character defining features of this house and then the character defining features of the block?
Well, it looked like single-story residential with a craftsman bungalow feel.
They're all 1.5 stories. They have the front porch recessed beneath the primary roof.
Well, they're depending on which way you're considering to be the entrance, that all of the ones on the street are facing basically with a gable front for your entrance, and being on the corner, which way is the gable in this case.
And this house is admittedly a little different. It's a little smaller. It's a
I
little
can't tell
newer.
material-wise, it looks like a different material. I can't tell the finishes of that, whether that's a CMU block and just painted or what it is. In
He's-
comparison to the other ones, you're looking at stucco and in this case, looks probably lap siding with the shingle, shingle and the infill on the gable end.
Where are these houses in relationship to this house? Are they across the street?
No, they're literally next door. There's a giant tree
This
right there,
So they're to the
Okay.
right here.
and it's between that house on the left.
So if you
Okay,
look at,
okay.
if you
So
look at
that
that
it's
picture
over
she
here.
just showed
Yes.
us,
Yeah,
and
okay.
you see this wood fence here, that wood fence is starting right there.
Okay.
And just start to
Yeah.
see that craftsman
okay.
style is right next door
This
to
one's
it.
missing the porch.
Yeah, this one doesn't have a porch.
They got a really big tree. Whose property is the tree on?
All right, so this giant tree, well, not really. Let's say a tree fell on this house, and it was total loss. Now it's a vacant lot. Based on the historic character of these homes, what would you expect to see rebuilt on this lot?
Craftsman style.
Or at least mimicking elements of the craftsman style?
Gables facing the roadway,
What do you think about this?
porch.
This is what was built?
Big tree's still there.
Yeah.
They took out the.
I made it up. I can't
They-
remember
they-
why the house
They
was.
got rid of the beautiful understory tree that was screening the hell out of the neighbors.
Here's the side profile.
I actually think that fits better than the previous house.
Yeah.
Aside from being 2 stories,
Right.
it's, with the front porch and the craftsman detail. Is there something to be said for even bringing in a certain newness, proportions, design details to a historic neighborhood. That if you're still using historic elements or details, bringing in sort of new contemporary proportions or elements to it.
I mean, that's the struggle that a lot of people have, particularly with residential neighborhoods, is people want bigger houses.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a challenge, especially if it's not a very deep lot, to make a bigger house without building a house with much larger scale
I think-
than the rest of the street. But looking at it in profile, so this is the corner lot again, driving past the street, I wouldn't call it secondary and subordinate to the rest of the street, but do you feel that it distracts or diminishes the historic character of the street? That's the question you have to ask yourself.
Oh.
And people may have different opinions on that, as
doesn't
long as
necess-
you're
It
grounding
doesn't
it.
necessarily diminish it, but it's not the same style as everything else on the street.
No, and it's much more massive of a structure than the other houses on the street.
I would say that the main thing that, when I give this example, that people get, that they have issue with is the scale. Because if you look at materials, they match, they tried to be consistent with materials. They even tried to match some of the architectural details, like the brackets. You know, the main thing is that it's a full 2 stories. They did do a hipped roof instead of a front-facing gable, and they did do a porch, which was consistent with the rest of the street. But, I mean, I intentionally choose very challenging examples because, you know, you're going to face these, and you're going to have to decide, you know, in your design guidelines, what's going to be appropriate in certain neighborhoods. If this was a neighborhood that wasn't all craftsman houses and, you know, had been developed over time or had been developed with all different kinds of architectural styles, maybe it would be more appropriate there. But if this is an entire neighborhood of craftsman homes, that's maybe you'd want to say, okay, can you just at least make it 1.5 stories instead of 2 stories in a big box, more rectangular shape. But it all depends on the context of the neighborhood.
It's interesting, as you're talking, I find myself, as a property owner, thinking maybe the opposite of, from a design perspective, which I do as well, is that by saying this property should stay a 1.5 stories and be more, saying, consistent with, all, since there's other craftsman properties right by it, sort of limiting that is maybe limiting the potential for that property. You're sort of capping what the potential value would be on that. You know what I'm saying? Because if you create a 2-story craftsman that fits, but it's more modern, the way that they did, you've really sort of maximized the value of it. This is my merchant thinking.
Sure.
So I work with merchants, and I'm a designer, so I get the design perspective. I think we have to be aware of the fact that, you know, what sort of limitations or guidelines that we would potentially propose may restrict the value of a certain property. I think it's a fair question to ask. If you're going to impose design guidelines, I think at least be aware of what sort of effect those guidelines might have.
Sure, and I guess we need to come back to the why here. Like, why does it matter what goes on this lot? Why does it matter what it looks like? So this is one house. What if a tree fell on the one 3 down, and then one across the street? And then you've got these infill houses. What used to be 1.5 story craftsman houses, you've lost it. It's now got this undue rhythm, and now the historic character that drew people to the neighborhood in the first place is now very slowly being diminished with every demolition or with every loss of house. So you just have to keep in mind why the neighborhood was created as a historic district in the first place, what you were trying to preserve, and how that will be affected by any infill development. It all depends on the neighborhood.
I think that's a really good question, but I'm just going to say this, that those craftsman homes, when they were built originally, probably were the most affordable. I had a home up in Minneapolis that was one of the Sears catalog homes. And now you come forward 100 years later, and to do repair work on some of those buildings, those homes, is incredibly expensive. So now you sort of taken what was originally affordable housing. And now it sort of becomes limited in what you can do with the property. And the repair or design elements sometimes can be really expensive. You know, I'm thinking outside of design, and I hear myself. My designer self says, well, no, that's just what you're saying. But at the same time, we have to be conscious of people, you know, who own these properties. You know,
I mean,
do we need things to stay frozen in time? Or,
And the answer is no, they don't need to stay frozen in time. But
they could have blended into this neighborhood by changing their front porch to be a gabled front porch at the one-story level, and then brought the second story back up so that you have, you know, a deep front porch
that's what I was
that's helping to
thinking.
transition to that second floor, and it will work. You know, what bothers me more from a standpoint on the site is the fact that they tore out their retaining wall that created a corner element that to me was a bigger design element that they completely lost, and then put in that cheap wood picket fence that doesn't do anything for their yard or for the corner. Because if you look at the way that the original house was, you came back, you had in that raised area, and then it dropped down, you know, and actually created space that they've lost that was historical from a neighborhood standpoint beyond just the building itself.
but if you look at the original building, the original house didn't have that porch. I mean, maybe it did, but it was removed
No,
over
it
the
didn't
years.
have the porch, but what I was talking about was from a landscape standpoint. It creates, that corner was created with that raised retaining wall and that flat yard, which in the new home, obviously, you don't see it as much, but it does slope back and up, and your side's sloping down. So it's changed the character of that corner as well, not just the building itself. You know, granted, unfortunately, historic preservation doesn't always, I mean, there wasn't anything significant from a landscape standpoint there, but from a design standpoint, it does affect the entire neighborhood as well. They still could have done a fence on top of that wall and still been able to create and maintain that
I
element of the
totally
corner.
agree. There was no way I could have supported that house on that lot. To me, it's totally out of character with that historic neighborhood. When I look at that house, what I see are dollar signs. And there's nothing wrong with dollar signs, but in a historic neighborhood, the most important thing is maintaining the absolute integrity of that neighborhood, for the very reason we don't want to have this leapfrog effect taking place that has happened in so many places. And I think there was a great travesty done there. It just doesn't fit. This is like, well, it just, in my opinion, does not fit. It's ruined that corner and ruined that neighborhood.
well, you wouldn't want to say that in a meeting.
No, I wouldn't want to say that in a meeting, but I'm not in a meeting, and I can voice my opinion.
Yes, yes,
Well,
yes,
this
yes.
isn't-
About
this isn't
this.
real.
No, I just want to bring it back to an earlier point
is
that
theory.
like, and I think you guys
This
are
is
doing a
here.
good job of this, is that when you're analyzing the plan, when you're analyzing the vacant lot, when you're analyzing the plans that they bring to you, you need to couch your thoughts and opinions using the Secretary of the Interior standards, and if you have design guidelines, using those. And I did want to say, the design guidelines can be flexible. Like, they do not have to be, you must do this, you must do that, you must not. Like I was talking about the door schedules. Some communities have like a 10-option door schedule where you can choose all of these different doors. They're not trying to restrict the property owner's, creative spirit or personal choices. You're just trying to minimize the impact that those changes would have to the historic structure because it was designated to protect it, and it was designated to protect the neighborhood. But you always have to try to strike a balance. So that would be my word of advice, is just you're trying to balance preserving and protecting the neighborhood and the structure with the fact that people live there and they want to make it their home and they want to be comfortable there. And you just have to find a way to strike a balance between the two. I chose very difficult examples on purpose.
Yes, you did.
There were no easy answers to any of these, but I
Yeah,
thought
that'd
that
be
you guys
great.
did great. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk You know what, I'm just gonna put the design guidelines out if you wanna look at them as examples. You guys have been here a long time though, so if you just wanna go home, I will send Trevor a PDF, a Google Drive folder of PDFs of all kinds of design guidelines if you wanna see what's out there and see examples. But y'all have been great. Thank you for putting up with my coughing fit. I really didn't think I was gonna make it.
You did a
But I
wonderful
did.
job.
It was the mint.
To your point about the homes, and when you have a historic community, we have the Beaumont Historic District, and when they voted on it, when they voted themselves into this historic district, one of the big things was, how can I afford to keep my house as it is, or, restore it and refurbish it and things. There was a lot of discussion about it. What they decided as homeowners is to go into the historic community and say, yes, this is what we want to do because it'll preserve the homes as they are. Yes, it may cost a little bit more money. So our guidelines that we created for that community helped us to keep the cost down too, because then we weren't, like she said, there are many doors, many windows, railings, there's only a couple of types of railings, columns. So we've selected, along with the homeowners, those types of guidelines. So it's pretty easy if a homeowner wants to come in. I mean, many of them have decided that they wanted to glass it all in, the front porch. And of course they can't. So that was one of the largest things we had to talk about. But there are ways of screening or adding to columns and things like that that give you the illusion that it's at least, it's not closed in, but it has a front porch. So the guidelines are important. But having the community buy into it, if you're going to create a historic district, is very important, especially on the cost. So that was really the biggest thing we had to work with, was getting the community to agree to it.
That public input and education and outreach is essential.
Yeah.
Do you all have any residential districts or just commercial?
We have residential districts.
Regulated historic?
No.
No.
Okay.
It's mostly commercial.
Okay. But yeah, you definitely you need to do public meetings and answer people's questions about what does it mean if my property is going to be designated, and just have an opportunity to ask questions. We have a bunch of freebies over here. Take whatever you'd like. But does anyone have any questions for me before we leave?
No, I just want to thank you
Oh, you're welcome.
very much for coming. I learned a lot, and thank you for indulging all my wild comments.
No, they were good comments. The more y'all talk, the more we have to talk about.
I don't do that during our normal public hearings when we have cases. I know how to behave.
Any other questions?
Megan, thank you so much for coming out and talking to us. I mean, I saw you up in DeLand, but this has kind of refreshed everything and kind of got me fired up a little bit.
Well, good.
Yes, it definitely got me fired up. Those examples were wonderful, very helpful.
I lived in most of the places where they were, so I had seen them change over time, like the building where they painted the 3-section commercial building and ripped
Yes.
out the front facade. I saw it happen, like, in front of my eyes. I was so upset. So now I stick it to him by putting it in trainings. But I won't tell you where it is.
Okay.
Have you hidden their email and contact information in the photos so
Yeah.
people can find it? And
Oh, how did that go? All right, well, thank you guys so much, and you have a good night.
Thank
Or,
you.
Wait, you have more to do, don't you?
a little bit.
All right. Next order of business is to adopt the 2020 meeting schedule. And do we have that?
We have that.
We had that in our packet, which I left at home.
I'll make a motion to adopt the meeting schedule for 2020 as presented.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Done. All right, and now we come to the section of public comment. Does anyone have anything for the greater good?
Thank you for coming.
Okay.
All right, if not, then we'll move to the informational section. Next meeting Tuesday, January 14th. Hope to see everybody there. fired up and ready to go for the next victim that comes in.
Okay.
All right, and with that adjournment, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second it.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Adjourned.
Awesome.